Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Squat Cobbler. I'm Dr. Mike at Official Pagan, and joining me, as always,
Hi, everybody. This is Kelly. I'm at KELLYTHUL on Twitter and Instagram. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, telling your friends, perhaps ordering a t shirt. All those things would be awesome if you give it a consideration. But we're just glad you're here. And we're
absolutely.
really glad you're here because we're here to talk about.
This is it. This is the big one. Kelly, I got to ask so that we have the soundbite. Are you a Shaq guy?
Um, no, no, I'm not. Never liked him as a player. um,
Now,
definitely
when you
don't
say
like.
player, he was if I remember correctly, a highlight player.
Yes, highlight and then a little bit of basketball. And we'll have to, it'll be interesting to see because there are several references um, as we talk about, I mean, step on your lead, SHAQ FU, but as we talk about SHAQ FU, there are some references that are a little bit reliant on knowing who he played for and what their name was and some things there, but we'll talk about that in a second. But I mean, tons of respect for the ability and the skill the guy had. I was just never a fan of him as a player or an actor in particular. I don't find him particularly. His commercial work's been interesting,
At that point,
but
I do have to ask, have you seen Shazam?
I have seen portions of Shazam, just
Have
like
you
I've
seen the
seen.
parts of Shazam where he raps?
No, no, I don't know.
See, you haven't really experienced Shaq yet.
Mm. You see, it strikes me that diction is like super helpful to a rapper, which which perhaps is not Shaq's like power place, but that's just me. But yeah, much like Venus, Goddess of Love, starring Vanna White, I have watched probably. There's only so much of that show I can consume in one sitting before I go. I think I need a break. And so,
You're tapping out at that point.
yeah, I tap out quick on that.
Well, Shaq Fu is a really interesting game. So at the time it was released, and not a sports guy in any way, not as a kid, not a basketball player. In fact, I would rank basketball lowest among the major professional sports in my interest level. Do like basketball games though, which is weird. Just video game, not like real analog human games. Video games. Um, Basketball video games I enjoy. Actual basketball as a sport, garbage. And no interest in professional sports at all. Obviously, though, Shaq was a huge celebrity at the time, so I was aware of who Shaq was. This game, though, was getting a lot of publicity when it came out. And I remember getting like decent reviews, which is true. Like I looked it up, like the actual reviews from game magazines and stuff. Don't get me wrong, nobody was like, this is my favorite game, but it got like solid reviews and a lot of hype around the game. Now, it's important to mention that because if you read things online or watch a lot of videos on YouTube, you would have the impression that this game was a gigantic failure and everybody in the world hates it. And that's just not the way it was because I was actually there. That's not really the way it was. Don't get me wrong. Nobody thought this was a great game, but also nobody was like starting a website to try and destroy every copy of SHAQ FU, which is a thing that exists now. But I guess the negative publicity has just grown the cult following around it because there's tons of people who debate this game all over online, positive, negative. There's people, who exalt the praises of this as some weird 90s thing relic that exists. And that's one of the important things I think to talk about. I've noticed in a lot of the videos I've seen of people who are not fans of this game. And again, there's legitimate complaints with this game, but for a lot of the people who are not fans, I think it's because they're a little younger and weren't there in the 90s. I know this seems like the stupidest thing in the world that a basketball player would get a video game deal to play a rapping kung fu guy. Because there was a tie-in album with this, by the way. There's a rap album called Shaq Fu. So a rapping, basketball player who fights with a saucer or something. I don't know. So I know that seems insane when you say it out loud, and that's what part of it is. But that's what the 90s were. So it was a lawless wasteland
Yep.
in the 90s. So, and to give you perspective, basketball stars in particular were really popular when I was a kid when this came out. And to the point where they would almost make anything with basketball stars in it. Like Shaq played a rapping genie in a movie. That's a real thing that exists. That's way worse than Shaq Fu. Michael Jordan was in a t-shirt commercial and they were like, this would be great as a 2-hour movie. And they did that. So, and they had this weird sex trafficker guy sing a song about it. It was a lawless wasteland. So it's important to give it real perspective. Another big thing that I've been seeing where I think, and I have to address these two topics before we can criticize it accurately. The other thing is a lot of people saying this is the worst fighting game of all time. There's a thing, I love horror movies, which means I've watched hours and hours and hours of garbage horror movies. Just like Kelly has watched tons of bad science fiction movies. My concept of what a bad movie is very different than the average person's. And I've learned this the hard way when I've gone to movies with friends and they're like, that's the worst thing I've ever seen. And I'm like, you haven't watched enough this is not, it's not good, but this isn't the worst thing ever. In the early 90s, when Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat were just making millions and millions of dollars and getting TV shows and movies and toys and everything else, anybody who had anything to do with video game making made a fighting game. So there was just this onslaught of fighting games, and most of them are unplayable. They're so terribly slapped together, unfinished nonsense, completely unplayable. This has problems, but this is not the worst fighting game. You have not played a lot of 90s fighting games if you think this is the worst fighting game. There's a lot. There's a lot of bad games out there. So I feel like it's important to get that stuff out of the way first before my genuine criticisms come in. But most importantly, sir, what did you think of SHAQ FU? Because you had not played this, right?
I had not. So I'm not a huge fighting game fan. I enjoy them, but it's not the genre that that's my go-to on a lot of things. But so I mean, I found it interesting. But it's what you get in the 90s. It's what you get with a ton of video games too. When there's this paper thin narrative that's going to be used when you go into story mode to kind of carry you through in this case, 11 battles you need to go through to complete the story side of SHAQ FU. You give grace to, you understand it's not going to be a tremendously intriguing plot, and so there was that piece. Gameplay wise, I think you're right in that it's certainly not the best fighting model that I've ever seen. It's not the worst either. It was just, to me, it felt like a middle of the road in terms of the execution of battle and fighting and doing all those things and doing special moves and dodging and all that stuff. I felt it was, it was solid. It was, average and enjoyable and fun to play. Wasn't, the highest end by far. The characters, because you've got the Mortal Kombat world out there at this point in time and all that. It was intriguing, the character set that they utilized for the battles. We'll probably talk a little more about that as we go in. But I wasn't familiar. I was expecting a lot worse, to be honest, because it just seemed, one, I think to the point you made earlier, there's just some noise out there now on this group of folks that wants to really say this is the worst thing ever. And it's not. And then plus it's just, okay, it's SHAQ FU. I was vaguely aware of SHAQ FU as a rap platform. And it's like, that's not great. But ended up being okay. I mean, beyond his little victory shuffle after every victory, they could have worked either for some more variety on that, or two, something a little bit better than the curly shuffle thing that he does.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm in the same place with it. We'll get into more detail, of course, but kind of middle of the road as far as the actual quality of the game. There are terrible, terrible fighting games out there. There's also games that are near perfect, like Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat, that it's not fair to compare not just SHAQ FU, but most other fighting games to. because those are the games that set the benchmark that everybody was chasing. So it's not reasonable to compare this to them. There is interesting stuff about this game though. So one of the good things I'll throw out there is that it is a fighting game starring Shaq. So there's a thing that was happening because basketball was so prominent at the time. There were a lot of basketball game franchises. So the NBA realized they could make a lot of money off of this, obviously, because I don't know if you guys know this, professional sports are played for money. They don't do this for the love of the game. The NBA is not, free tickets and free merchandise and stuff like that. So they realized there was a lot of money to be made in games. So they started charging more and more for the licensing. So what game companies started to do was say, well, we're going to just pay individual players to make games around them and leave the NBA out of it. So as much as, again, I think people are a little too young who are making some of these videos and weren't around at that time, this was actually not that out of place at the time that it came out. There was a long string of NBA players starring in games that either didn't have the NBA or in some cases didn't have basketball as a major plot point or device of the gameplay. Going back to Michael Jordan had a Mario-style platforming game that had nothing to do with the NBA or anything like that. Some other players like Charles Barkley and things like that had basketball games, but not NBA games. They were more like street basketball games with unnamed teams and players that you would play against. So this wasn't as out of place as it seems in hindsight at the time that it came out. And with fighting games being as huge as they were and Shaq doing weird kung fu stuff, which I remember being a thing, this, I guess, made sense to a marketing person at a game company.
Yeah, and while they couldn't, for licensing reasons and to keep the costs down, so they didn't go underneath the NBA banner and all the charges that would be accompanying that. They did everything they could to make, because this is who this is and who he plays for. And at that point in time, Shaq came into the league, he joined the Orlando Magic, who sported the blue shorts with stripes, a very unique outfit for the NBA, which is the gear. The shorts part are almost a direct Orlando Magic knockoff. They do a little bit with the jersey so that they can have deniability. And then if you go back and rewatch a lot of the dialogue in this, going off almost right from the beginning when he meets the shopkeeper, there's lots of talking about magic and Shaq being related to magic, and it's all looking to kind of do the wink and the tie back to that without actually
saying it.
Without saying it. Yeah.
Yeah. So this I know in hindsight seems crazy and out of place. There's a ton of games like this, maybe not exactly like this, but in this genre of like, let's pull these people out and see if they're just as popular if we slap them on anything. So this wasn't that out of place. This was made by Delphine Software, who made Out of This World and Flashback. So naturally, they seem like the perfect company to tackle a fighting game.
Everything else was prequel to fighting game and NBA.
I'll say that the fact that they're the ones who did the actual programming on this and developing in the game is its biggest strength and biggest weakness of the game. Because they brought so many of these fighting games, not counting Mortal Kombat and the other ones that use digitized actors for a more realistic look. So many of these fighting games went for the Street Fighter sort of anime sprite look, except without putting any of the time and money into it. So they all look like really kind of cheap cartoon knockoffs. They brought that same rotoscope style that they used for Flashback to this. So you get detailed characters that aren't digitized actors the way Mortal Kombat is, but detailed looking characters, very detailed backgrounds with lots of animation and everything. More about that in a minute, but lots of detail and very, very fluid character animation, which is something that's missing from a lot of fighting games at that time. That's also the biggest drawback of this game. It doesn't move the way Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter do. Because the characters are so fluid in the way that they move a little bit slower, and it's a little more tempered, their jumps and movements and things like that, where it just plays differently than every other fighting game which copied either Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter. So I can see a lot of people at that time who were used to that style of gameplay jumping into this and it not translating well. So I think that Delphine made this is its strength and weakness all rolled into one.
Yeah, and you see it particularly in the opponents, and a lot of them is that they get it. Not only do they have the fluidity you talk about, but they get a ton of expressiveness out of each kind of unique targeted character that they bring in, that is reflective of more fluid human-like movement. But in a fighting game, it's not such always fluid human movement, right, as much as remarkably quick button bashing destroy you movement.
Right. Yeah, for the people who like the fast paced button mashing of Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, this isn't it. And that's its biggest fault, really. So again, it's kind of a double-edged sword there. But there's a lot of cool things that they did that I do think elevate the gameplay. The gameplay is average, but I would say that what elevates it is they do a few interesting things. There's no palette swap characters in this game. And that's a really important thing because that was super common for fighting games at the time. Every major fighting game and all their knockoffs had palette swap characters. Mortal Kombat is the most infamous for doing it because they would have characters who were just ninjas. So they would just change the color of the same ninja outfit. And they're like, oh, this is this new character, whatever his name is. To the point where I think at one point there was like 10 different palette swap characters in some of the later games. Street Fighter did it and all the other ones did it as well. There's no palette swap character in this game. So that's really interesting. So that means a lot more work had to be put into the game. So you're talking a lot more animation and things like that. That's the purpose of doing the palette swap character, is you're getting a whole extra character with none of the work that you put into it. So you can focus more on getting the game fast and getting the fighting mechanics down, which they didn't do in this game, going back to strength and weakness being the same thing.
Yeah. And I hadn't, until you said it, I hadn't really noticed that, but you're dead on. And this is a remarkably unique, each opponent is a whole different thing in this, and there's nothing that even comes close to being a palette swap.
No. Now, sticking with the whole Delphine thing, much like Flashback, this is painfully, I would say more so than Flashback or anything else, it is painfully obvious that this was developed on the Genesis first. And the reason that I say that is I played every single version of this game for this review. I'd only ever played the Genesis version before. If you play the other versions, you're going to have a different experience because every version other than the Genesis version is missing big chunks of the game. The worst, I would say, is actually the Super Nintendo version, which is probably what half of the people played at the time this came out.
That'd be me.
So the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions are vastly different and in a nonsensical way. The only thing I can imagine is because it was developed on Genesis and they wanted to get the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions out at the same time, they must have rushed development on the Super Nintendo version. It's missing like 4 or 5 characters, 3 or 4 different stages, tons of special moves and different unlockable things. There's just so much that's completely gone from the game. And I'm saying it's the worst version because it doesn't look the worst. We'll get to that. But there's no excuse for that. They're similarly powered systems. Super Nintendo has a little bit more of a color palette and a little bit of a better sound chip because they came out later than Genesis did, but Genesis has a better processor. The games are known to move faster. So, I mean, they have their strengths and weaknesses, but they're similarly powered systems. There's no reason it's missing half of the game, essentially, other than they didn't finish it and wanted to get them out on the same day. So I could see if somebody played the Super Nintendo version thinking, wow, this game really sucks. And then I played all the other versions as well. I'm still going to put Super Nintendo last because there's no excuse for it to be missing everything that it is. There were handheld versions for Game Boy and Game Gear. They're not good, but in the way you'd expect them to not be good. Like they're missing a lot of stuff. They're missing tons of animation. The characters are hard to tell apart, especially in the Game Boy version, where it's monochromatic and the characters are even smaller. But you would expect that going into that.
Yeah.
So again, that's why I would put those above Super Nintendo. No excuse for that. Second place, I would actually have to put the Amiga port of it. The Amiga is missing a lot of detail, but everything, as far as I can tell, is in the game. Technically, it has all of the characters. It's the only version other than the Genesis version that has all of the characters. And as far as I know, all the stages were in there. I don't remember. Now they're missing a lot. If you play the Genesis version, the stages have things constantly going on in the backgrounds. Lots of animation, different characters that pop in and out, different environment elements and things you can interact with. None of that's in the Amiga version, but all the stages are there and all the characters are there. So I give it second place only because there's no reason Super Nintendo is missing everything it's missing. But for what it's worth, Super Nintendo does sound slightly better than the Sega Genesis version.
And it gives at least the background animation a wave. It's not a static background.
Yeah.
There is an attempt to say, look, something's kind of moving back here. If you squint hard enough, it's not a fluid motion, to say the least. But each of the Super Nintendo backgrounds for the battles have. You could tell they took a step to, okay, well, damn it, something's moving in this. What's going to move? Okay, this is what's going to move. But it's highly repetitive. Flintstones like repeat every so many frames kind of thing going on with the animation in the background on Super Nintendo.
Yeah, and the Sega Genesis is just, if you're going to go play this game, you want to play the Sega version of the game. All the characters, all the backgrounds, all the moves, everything you can unlock, all of the background animation. I would say Amiga second, although Amiga is missing. Amiga, the backgrounds are static and they're missing a lot of elements of the backgrounds as well. So probably the most intensive background is like a lab setting that has all these different experiments and stuff they're working on. It has the lab and is missing all the experiments, things like that. So the Amiga version is trimmed down pretty significantly. It's also missing some music and things like that, but the whole actual game is in there, unlike Super Nintendo. And of course, the handheld versions are terrible, but all fighting games on handhelds at that time were kind of terrible.
Yeah.
They were still trying to figure out how to do that, really. So they play the way you would expect them to play. Now, did you just play Super Nintendo? Or did you
I did. I watched a little bit of video on a couple of other platforms, but in terms of actual interaction, I knew you had all the other platforms covered, so I was like, good. I'll just do the Super Nintendo. So I was unaware I missed as much as I did based on that. So
yeah, there's a lot back to the game if you play the Genesis version. If you're ever looking to revisit it, go for the Genesis version.
Yep, well, I can do that.
Yeah, it's worth it for the revisit for that, and of course the Amiga, because you're an Amiga guy. And like I said, while the Amiga is missing a lot, it's all more like it's stripped back, but everything essentially is in there as opposed to Super Nintendo. Now, you did mention you weren't too much of a fighting game guy. What are some of the fighting games you were into?
Well, I mean, so it was standard fare stuff. So I actually like Tekken a lot.
Okay.
And then of course Street Fighter as well. The whole kind of Marvel versus Capcom kind of stuff and all that was always, and then the licensed character kind of stuff was kind of fun as well. So I'd say that was probably it. I'd say that in terms of a fighting game I would go back to on a regular basis, probably Tekken.
Solid choice, of course. So here's an interesting one that we could, again, bringing up Amiga. So I was looking for fighting games on Amiga after I played SHAQ FU on there. There's a Mortal Kombat port that's on there and a few other things I was testing out. There was an Amiga, and I believe it's a Amiga 32 game. It's called Capital Punishment.
Oh, name's familiar. I never purchased that, but that name is super familiar.
So apparently there was a lot of controversy around this game. And when I was looking up Amiga fighting games, everybody was like, Capital Punishment's the one that everybody talks about. They're like, it's not a good game, but it's the most noteworthy. So that might be one for you to check out, and we'll see if we want to do a show on that at some point. I totally understand why. I didn't even have to delve very far into the game. immediately understand where all the controversy surrounding the game was coming from. So since SHAQ FU is kind of a controversial fighting game, if you guys like this, maybe we should do Capital Punishment next.
Be good. Yep. Yeah, and we finally completed the trilogy.
We did. Yeah. The trilogy that a lot of you didn't realize, but now you can complete your lives as gamers.
That's right. Didn't realize it was there. Now you do. But SHAQ, so SHAQ FU, the cover photo of SHAQ from SHAQ FU used to grace the framing elements of our videos for a long time. It took us so long to get this done. That's gone by the time we get there. But there used to be. You go back to a couple of the old squad calibers, you'll see SHAQ pop up here and there. But we've got for the cleaner, meaner look lately. So no SHAQ for you. Sorry. Maybe he'll pop up through the power of video editing for a reminder of what he looked like.
We'll SHAQ one out every here and there.
Yep, indeed.
And for what it's worth, they did eventually make a sequel to this game, like more recently made a sequel to this game because of all of the cult following that it has now, both positive and negative. Personally, I have not played the sequel. I think I'm just going to leave it the way that it is for me, the nostalgia of the original game and occasionally revisiting it only on Sega or Amiga, not on any of those other systems again.
Sounds fair.
All right. Is there anything else you wanted to add to SHAQ FU?
Nope. SHAQ'd out. So I'm good to go.
All right. Well, thank you for listening, everybody, and have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.